Macmillan Audio presents The Death and Life of Aida Hernandez by Aaron Bobrow-Strain. Read for you by Frankie Maria Corzo. Prologue. The Death of Aida Hernandez. August 10th, 2008. Camilla looked down at Aida's wrecked body and couldn't see a trace of the cousin she remembered from childhood. Years earlier, when she was a girl living in Douglas, Arizona, Camilla would cross the border into Mexico almost every weekend to play with Aida and her sisters. They ruled a gravelly playground near Aida's house in Agua Prieta. They ran free at an uncle's ranch on the outskirts of town. Aida had been the silly, sunlit one, the cousin with the dimpled cheeks and enviable curls. That girl was almost stubbed out. Her face was swollen, her lips pallid, matted blood crusted on her bandaged arms. Newer blood-soaked painted moist shapes on the sheet covering her gashes. A tube stitched into her abdomen leaked sticky pink liquid. Aida tried to smile up at her cousin. "It's okay," Camilla said. "Just lie still." But Aida twisted on the ambulance gurney, staring up through tubes and leads. "You're going to be okay," Camilla repeated. She didn't know what else to tell her childhood playmate, now 20 and a mother, dying beside her. The ambulance rattled through Agua Prieta, heading for the border. Camilla had not seen much of her cousin in recent years. Camilla was determined to stay out of trouble. She wanted to finish school and be a teacher in Douglas, just across the international line from Agua Prieta. The ambulance jolted over a break in the pavement, and Aida shrieked. She had fought to live all day. She'd staggered through the ER doors just before dawn on her own power. She'd survived surgery and conferred with police. "I'm all right," she'd reassured her mother in Arizona by telephone. "Stay there, I'll be fine. Don't try to cross the border." When a nurse tried to adjust her sheet, Aida had bolted upright to fight against it. She'd been stabbed so many times that she thought the nurse was pulling a shroud over her head. "I'm not dead," she'd yelled over and over. Around noon, her father, unable to pay for the private hospital and despairing over the level of care in Mexico, arranged an ambulance to take Aida north. They'd try their luck finding care in Arizona, one last chance to save her life. Camilla had volunteered to accompany her cousin in the ambulance. Crossing the border would be easy for Camilla. She was a U.S. citizen, but Aida was not. International agreements allowed residents of Agua Prieta to receive emergency care in the United States. But a lot could go wrong in the crossing, Camilla thought. The ambulance turned north onto Avenida 20. Behind it were the small Mexican border city's high-tech assembly factories, its tin-roofed houses, its broom and brick-maker districts, and its pirate car lots selling luxury SUVs to the newly narco-wealthy. Ahead lay Agua Prieta's squat downtown, the steel border wall, and then Douglas. The two towns had been so closely intertwined for so long that some people called them Dogla Prieta. Residents just a few years older than Camilla and Aida remembered a time when kids played pickup baseball games spanning both sides of the line. Home plate, marked by a plastic bag, lay in a scrubbed field on the U.S. side, while Agua Prieta's Calle Internacional formed the outfield. On a day-to-day basis, adults from both countries had scrambled across the ditch or ducked through a ragged chain-link fence to run errands and visit family on the other side. They mingled north to south and south to north. Longer-term migration followed predictable cycles, the same people crossing the U.S. border at the same point in the same season to tend crops on the same farms. When the season finished, they returned home to Mexico, year after year. But in this summer of 2008, the towns weren't as close as they had once been. New policies, new people, new suspicions, and new border crackdowns had pushed a wedge between them. Avenida 20 was a paved boulevard, so the ambulance picked up speed. It rushed through Agua Prieta's city center past cowboy boot emporiums, dentist offices, and pharmacies catering to American retirees. In the distance sprawled clubs and bars where preppy Mexican teens, Douglas High School students, and drug dealers had partied together behind mirrored glass the night before. Camilla looked from the ambulance window to her cousin. "We're almost there," she said. The ambulance had gone as far north as it could and turned west onto Calle Internacional. From there, it raced along the international line itself. To the right, rusting steel bars blurred by, the latest border wall. Aida's father, Raul, followed the ambulance in a battered pickup loaded with family. He pulled as close to the port of entry as the queue of cars waiting to cross allowed. Raul had seen his closest friends die in pitched gunfights, and he himself had survived torture in Mexico's most infamous political prison. He knew that when it was time to act, you did everything you could do, and then you did a little more. When he'd rushed to the hospital just after dawn that morning, he'd grabbed the deed to his house. Even in his panicked state, he knew that he'd need it as collateral for his daughter's hospital bills. When it came to such details, Raul liked to get it right, and now his girl was dying, his sunlit girl. He and his daughter had clashed the night before. They'd screamed and yelled, rattling the wood paneling on his cinder block walls. In the end, she'd stormed out. The $20 she hoped to earn that night was her future, she'd shouted at him. A step toward reuniting with her son. At the hospital afterward, Aida had made sure that her sister recovered the cursed $20 bill, folded in the pocket of her sliced-off jeans. Now Raul watched her ambulance pull into an emergency lane on its way to the United States. Francisco Frank Hone also watched, waiting on the Arizona side as the ambulance exited Mexico and turned into the crowded border crossing. A Douglas Fire Department veteran, Frank had overseen dozens of emergency transfers across the international line. He knew the drill. The Agua Prieta ambulance driver pulls into an express lane, unloads the patient, and makes a quick stop for Customs and Border Protection clearance. Then Frank wheels the patient toward his waiting rig. This takes place in what looks like a highway toll plaza at rush hour, albeit one bristling with cameras, dogs, X-ray apparatus, and automatic weapons. It was routine, unless something went wrong. And it seemed to Frank that something had just gone wrong. At the ID check, inspectors in black-blue uniform surrounded the gurney, halting its passage with shouts and arm-waving. On the Mexico side, a white pickup screeched into the crossing, and a family leaped out. Camilla unfolded herself from the ambulance's back door, and from the United States, a brass-blonde woman carrying a little boy streaked toward the gurney. Just past Frank, the woman with the toddler collided with a wall of raised palms and shouted commands. It was Aida's mother, Luz, holding Aida's son. She shouldered forward to reach Aida's side, contorting to shield the boy from the sight of his mother's body. The voices of family, border guards, and Mexican paramedics pitched and rolled. Sunday afternoon shoppers returning to Mexico from the Douglas Walmart stopped to stare. Pushing through to the gurney, Frank could see the patient didn't have much time. Her face was the color of cigarette ash. Her lower eyelid, when he pulled it down, was white and waxy. Frank knew border officials weren't heartless. In the hard years, when Douglas was one of North America's busiest and most dangerous human trafficking corridors, he had seen federal agents sobbing over the bodies of dead migrants more than once. But he also knew that even the sickest patient could be refused entry for bureaucratic reasons. Cases like that often came down to a pissing match, he knew. and as a ranch hand turned high school football player turned firefighter, Frank figured that he could piss up there with the best of them. Frank launched into an argument with the officer in charge, and someone knocked into Aida's gurney. The jolt against her rigid body shook her to life one more time. Aida's eyes startled wide, and her voice appeared, first as an exploding howl, then in precise English words. "Please, I have a son, a U.S. citizen's son. Let me pass." Her words brought the fight to a sudden stop. Frank saw his opening. "Which one of you wants to be responsible for this woman's death?" he demanded. "If one of you wants the liability, sign this form and I'm out of here." The group of dark uniforms stared at Frank, and in that moment, barely waiting for a response, he wheeled the patient away, out of one of the most heavily secured sites in the American Southwest. Later, Frank Hone watched Arizona Lifeline 2 lift off on its way to Tucson's University Medical Center. A crowd had gathered in the border JCPenney parking lot to see the helicopter go. Now they shielded their eyes from the afternoon sun and followed the aircraft rising into the sky. The red shell climbed over surveillance towers and access roads cut in the desert. It skimmed across blue-black slag mountains and skirted one of the world's largest border patrol stations. Then, over the Rusty Mule Mountains, it faded from view. Frank looked down at his clipboard and noted the woman's name, Aida Hernandez. Frank knew he had done his best that day, but he also knew that Aida Hernandez would not make it. No Country for Young Women, Part 1. 1. Girl in a Labyrinth. Aida awoke to the smell of homemade flour tortillas and the sound of her mother singing. Luz always sang the same song while she cooked, Triste Recuerdo by Antonio Aguilar. Aida thought her mother sang beautifully. She poured out the long notes like honey from her brother's ranch on the outskirts of Agua Prieta. Aida was 8, and her parents were the objects of her deep affection and contemplation. Aida loved to sit on the couch watching her parents in the morning before school. Raul and Luz made a funny mismatched pair. He was in his early 50s, short and taciturn. She, almost 20 years younger, was tall, loud, and güera. Aida didn't understand her father's meetings or his books, but she knew that he'd once talked with the president of Mexico at a summit in Nogales. Now he worked at a Japanese factory assembling something. Aida didn't know what. To 8-year-old Aida, her mother's work was more exciting. Each morning after Aida and her sisters left for school, Luz would open the small video and convenience store she ran out of the garage. When school was out, Aida would spend hours sitting beside her mother, surrounded by shelves of snacks and the clatter of dubbed action movies. Those days had a regular, sun-baked rhythm in Aida's mind. Agua Prieta was balanced on the northern rim of Mexico, tucked away from more important and populous parts of the country. In the 1990s, it had only just outgrown its cattle ranch roots. The city felt both small and large at the same time. Even on cold winter days, the sun was bright, and Aida could play outside. After school, Aida and her 2 sisters would come home and change out of their uniform skirts. They'd rush through homework under their mother's watchful eye and shoot across the street to the playground. Aida was the middle sister between Jennifer, age 13, and Cynthia, age 6. The unexpected new babies, Jasmine and Emiliano, born a year apart, were still too small to count. Nothing had come between the sisters yet. They ran and swooped and played with abandon, dizzying themselves on the merry-go-round, their legs sweeping the sky. They squealed together in pure joy. They shot hoops with older boys and climbed anything that could be climbed. They knew every jagged metal splinter, every missing guardrail, and every trip hazard in the playground. They lived for the flawless moment suspended in the air after leaping into space. The 3 sisters would only sit still after they had scaled to the top of the monkey bars, Taking in the whole playground, they would perch together at the apex, inventing futures for themselves, their 6 knees waving in the air. I'm going to live in Los Unites and have a hot husband and a daughter named Samantha. Jennifer, the oldest, swore. The others agreed to follow her lead. To prepare for their future lives, Jennifer, Ida, and Cynthia practiced English. Usually this meant mimicking the sounds David Bowie made in Labyrinth, their all-time favorite movie. Sometimes they shouted the lyrics of What's Up by 4 Non-Blondes, which mostly consisted of the word hey repeated a million times. When I'm older, Ida announced one day, I'm going to live in a big-ass city, New York City. With her baby lisp, it came out, New York City. Of course you are, little monkey, Jennifer answered. We know you will. Some nights, Luz and Raul attended a meeting of the Agua Prieta Search and Rescue Club. The girls would slip out to the playground after their parents left. While Luz and Raul practiced searching for lost hikers with their clubmates, Ida and her sisters danced under streetlights. Those forbidden nights on the playground all ended the same way. One of the other neighborhood kids would whistle a warning. Another would yell, Hey, Hernandez's, your parents are coming. Ida and her sisters would rocket off the jungle gym in unison and hit the hard-packed dirt running. Ida knew the routine the way she knew the scars on her knees. She flew over the low fence and spun out of the park. She paused to help Cynthia cross the street, and then all 3 crashed through the metal gate of their house. Inside, skating across polished concrete, they landed on the couch, just as their parents' car pulled up. Raul and Luz let themselves into their modest government housing unit and put down their things. Their daughters peeked up from the video they'd flipped on and were pretending to watch. Their parents wore matching tan search and rescue uniforms. Labyrinth again? Luz asked. Some nights, Luz didn't see through the act. On other nights, she shouted until the house shook. I thought I had girls. You don't act like girls. She'd yell on those nights. Girls don't scrape knees or play outside after dark, she'd scold. Then they'd eat leftovers from the day's big afternoon meal together, and Luz's consternation would fade. Days, weeks, and seasons passed in much the same way, there on the northern edge of Mexico. School, playground, tienda. Homework, playground, tienda. The sisters took care of their new siblings and watched videos. They managed not to break many bones, and they imagined that life would continue this way, like their one brakeless bicycle. And it did, until the night Raul asked his question, and the world fell out of balance. They were eating supper. It began like any other bit of conversation. Luz, I have a question for you. I want you to be 100% honest with me. To Ida, it sounded ordinary, but Luz set her jaw into a ram. Girls, go to your rooms right now, she said, not looking at her husband. It was the first of many bewildering commands Ida would obey that week. Huddled in her room with Jennifer and Cynthia, she didn't get to hear the question or the answer, but she heard the recriminations and the screaming sobs that followed, the chairs clattering to the floor and ricocheting off the walls. When the babies woke up crying that night, no parent came. Ida and her sisters got up instead and tried to hush them. They climbed together into one bed and pulled covers over their ears to blot out the sounds of fighting. Eventually, they fell into a ragged sleep, curled in one another's arms. By morning, it all felt like a bad dream. Ida's parents got ready for work as usual. The girls got ready for school. March 8th, 1996 passed like many other days. At school, Ida was ready to learn. The teachers, though, were less than excited to teach. For many of them, teaching was a second or third job. If they showed up late or wandered away from class in mid-lesson to smoke a cigarette, it was only because all the other jobs they worked to make ends meet left them exhausted. Ida knew this because they didn't miss a chance to remind their pupils of how little the Secretaría de Educación Pública paid them. The morning after the fight, teachers and students alike shivered. The temperature outside rose into the 70s, but the school's cement classrooms gripped the night's cold long after noon. Aida's teeth chattered as she tried to study. After last period, she ran outside to find her father, who always walked her home. Instead, she found Cynthia waiting. The crowded school divided pupils into day shifts and evening shifts. That year, Aida attended school in the day. Her little sister went to class at night. Cynthia's appearance on the sidewalk as Aida got out was unusual. "We gotta go," Cynthia said. She was worried. To Aida's questions, she only replied, "Just come on, we gotta go." As the house came into view, a wave of confusion rolled over Aida. Her parents weren't wealthy, but they owned a car. And yet, there idling in front of the house was a dented white taxi like the kind poor people took when they couldn't use the bus. "We never take taxis," she thought. Luz emerged from the house and stuffed soft garbage bags of clothes into the open trunk, not noticing the girls. "Mom, are we taking a trip?" Aida asked, thrilled by the possibility. For the moment, Luz's two big convenience store sunglasses hid the bruise spreading down the bridge of her nose. "Mom, answer me." Raul appeared next. He called Aida and Cynthia in to join Jennifer, who stood shivering next to an electric heater in the living room. "Girls, I need to ask you something." Another question from their father. "Girls, do you want to live with me here or go with your mother?" The question was incomprehensible. It might as well have been asked in English by David Bowie wearing Goblin King makeup. But Raul, standing there spent and defeated, clearly expected an answer. Cynthia looked up at Aida. Aida looked up at Jennifer. Jennifer was 4 years and 7 months older than Aida. She knew everything. Jennifer stalled, feeling the weight of decision land on her 5-foot frame. "Mom?" she said eventually. "I guess." It seemed logical. Girls went with their mothers. No one knew why. Aida and Cynthia nodded in agreement. They followed Jennifer in everything. Riding away, the 3 girls knelt in a row on the back seat of the taxi, watching their father disappear. When he'd walked them to the taxi, telling them he loved them, he had still seemed like the solidest, most reliable thing in the world to Aida. Now he was a bent old man, sinking into the distance. Aida had never seen him cry before. Aida wheeled on her mom. "What is happening? Where are we going?" she asked. But Luz just stared straight ahead through the cracked window shield. After a few minutes, the border came into view. Little more than a dry ditch and ragged chain-link fence marked the international divide in the spring of 1996. "Mom," Aida wanted an answer. "Shut up, Aida," Jennifer snapped. "Just shut up." No one spoke after the taxi dropped them off at the border crossing. The girls kept quiet at the port of entry, carrying their baby siblings, Jasmine and Emiliano, and their plastic bags of possessions. Luz displayed a card to the INS officer, and they hustled into a U.S. taxi, waiting on the other side. The girls exchanged questioning glances. Anticipation poked in around the anger and confusion. The taxi pulled out around the Border Safeway and JCPenney. In those days, residents of Agua Prieta could easily obtain short-term border crossing cards that allowed them to visit family and shop in southern Arizona. As a result, a significant portion of Douglas's municipal budget came from sales tax paid by Mexican shoppers. The girls had often accompanied their mother to Douglas on shopping trips or to see their U.S. citizen cousins in Arizona. Sometimes Luz dragged them on long, tedious visits to their family friend Saul's house, but this trip, with all their possessions crammed into a taxi, was clearly different. The taxi didn't pull into the Safeway parking lot. It passed the street where their cousin Camilla lived and kept going. Soon it left behind the little bit of Douglas that Aida recognized. Against her will, Aida took in the new scenery with rising delight. Her sisters' faces told the same story. The fight, the rushed packing, the taxis. This was not how they imagined going to live in Los Unites back on the playground. But the ride through Douglas still felt like the beginning of something new. The realization brushed up against sad memories of their father, but Ida and her sisters couldn't help feeling excited. With a bump, the taxi pulled off the pavement into a dusty neighborhood of strange metal houses on cinder blocks. Ida had never seen houses made of metal before. They were going to live in America, she realized. The taxi delivered them to a dirt-colored brick casita. It had a small kitchen, a bedroom, and a miniature bathroom for the 6 of them. A fridge and stove were the extent of its furniture. Eventually, a man arrived with 2 mattresses. The girls knew him well. They had played with Saul's children. They'd spent stifling hours waiting in his living room while he and their mother disappeared together. "This is not right," Jennifer said. She'd put 2 and 2 together fast. Ida and Cynthia still didn't know what was happening. "Fuck no," Jennifer said. That was how Ida came to live in the United States. Her new home was in Pirtleville, a dusty neighborhood on the northern edge of Douglas. Mexican-American laborers had carved Pirtleville out of scrubland in the early 20th century. Those original residents had done the dirtiest, most dangerous work at the Phelps Dodge copper smelter, Douglas's main employer at the time, and they did it for half the wage of their Anglo counterparts. The smelter's mustard-gray smoke would settle hard over Pirtleville in those days. It tortured throats and sooted laundry, but residents were proud and independent. For most folks, the sulfurous air smelled like opportunity. Indeed, Douglas had been a relatively prosperous place during much of the almost a century between its founding in 1901 and the smelter closure in 1987. For a desert outpost whose population never exceeded 20,000, the town once had an almost cosmopolitan air. This story began when the Scottish-Canadian adventurer and metallurgist James Douglas journeyed from the east on behalf of the Phelps Dodge Mining Corporation. In the early 1880s, he worked his way from Albuquerque to Tucson, leading a string of pack mules. Then he pushed on to Bisbee and Morenci, where he developed what would become 2 of the world's most productive copper mines. In the 1890s, he added to Phelps Dodge's growing empire by acquiring mine claims in northern Mexico. At that point, only one thing stood in the way of Phelps Dodge's ascendance as a global corporation. The company needed a smelter in the west and asked Douglas to pick a location. He chose a spot at the bottom of the broad Sulphur Springs Valley in far southeastern Arizona. The Gadsden Purchase establishing the border between the United States and Mexico in that stretch of desert was less than 40 years old. The border still felt more imaginary than real in most places. At the time, binational bands of cowboys staged cattle roundups in the spot, drawn by its abundant ground and surface water. American cowboys called the damp oasis White Water Draw. Mexican cowboys called it Agua Prieta, Black Water. The one thing they agreed on was that, water aside, the location lay hundreds of miles from anything that mattered and would never amount to much. James Douglas, on the other hand, saw great promise in the valley's strategic position, extending out toward mines on both sides of the border. He gave his name to a burgeoning new town, and twin smelters rose from the desert. After Arizona gained statehood in 1912, a copper star blazed at the center of its state flag. A copper dome topped the state capitol, and Douglas's smelters poured a steady stream of the state's molten sustenance. By the 1920s, the town had nearly 10,000 people, and by the 1930s, its smelters could pour almost 1 million pounds of blister copper a day. Douglasites called the company PD, as if it were an impressive, benevolent relative known only by his initials. PD's copper built a library, a hospital, and schools. Workers could purchase just about anything they wanted on credit at a modern 3-story company store. Copper attracted virtuoso violinists from France and ballet troupes from Russia. The Douglas High School band was big and well-equipped. and when sports teams needed to travel to championships on either side of the border, Phelps Dodge covered the costs. The culture of the company permeated the town built around it. PD's rules were the town's rules, not officially, but in effect. PD's shift whistle governed the rhythm of the town's days. The price of copper governed the rhythm of its years. When the price was high, Douglas boomed. When it fell, the town scrimped. During market gluts and strikes, PD idled its furnaces and the town languished. In return for benevolent paternalism, the company demanded loyalty and gained a reputation for violent union busting. Not until after 1935, when Congress passed the first national legislation protecting the right to organize and strike, would unions successfully brave PD country. When they did, the International Union of Mine, Mill, and Smelter Workers led the way. Unlike many U.S. unions, Mine Mill championed racial equality. The union's stance was crucial in Douglas, where the PD smelter followed a two-tier wage system. Anglos received one rate, and Mexican Americans received another, about 50% lower for the same work. Race governed what jobs a man could get and how high he could rise in the company. It determined what bathrooms he'd be allowed to use at work and how doctors would treat his family at the PD hospital. Mexican-American workers and small business owners in Douglas had long organized themselves in mutual aid societies. Now, a national union would help them fight for safer conditions and an end to the two-tier wage system. PD tried to divide and conquer organized labor, branding Mine Mill as the Mexican Union and firing workers who dared to strike. In 1941, however, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a ruling that would serve as a cornerstone of the post-war era of rising wages and declining inequality. The Phelps-Dodge Rule, as it came to be called, made it illegal for companies to refuse to hire workers because of union membership. A year later, Mine Mill won the right to represent workers at the Douglas smelter. After World War II, union contracts outlawed the two-tier pay rate, and Mexican Americans clawed their way into higher positions in the company. Wages rose steadily from the 1950s to the 1970s. With strong industrial demand for copper in the post-war period, PD could afford it. Workers, company, and town prospered together. In Pirtleville, kilned brick ranch houses, some with their own in-law casitas like the one Aida and her family now occupied, replaced the community's original adobes. The children of smelter workers could earn college degrees and find professional employment despite discrimination. Through the post-war period, Douglas embodied the dream of a Mexican-American industrial middle class. The town was still, by most measures, a poor place, but it had jobs, schools, a sense of purpose, and a vision of what it could become. By the time Aida and her family arrived in 1996, though, the town had changed. After PD closed the smelter complex in 1987, the bad air cleared and the good jobs disappeared. By 1996, little remained of the smelter except ghostly slag heaps, residual heavy metals, and a lingering feeling of betrayal. The promise of a Mexican-American middle class was snuffed out. In the final years of the 20th century, Pirtleville, with its population of 1,500, ranked as one of the poorest census-designated places in the United States. When Aida and her family taxied into this dusty outskirt of Douglas, half the children in Pirtleville lived under the poverty line.
That'll be the end of this chapter, and the rest will load. Thank you.